Welcome back to the show, everybody. Our guest this evening is a historian and author of such books as the 14th Amendment and the Incorporation Doctrine, as well as the book that I have right here on my desk, ladies and gentlemen. That's Compact of the Republic, the League of States and the Constitution. You can get all of that and more at his website, which is www.davebenner.com. Dave Benner, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think it was a well-reasoned choice to have me follow Tom Woods. Very good deduction in that.
Yeah, well, I mean, amen, brother. I've told people that, we've only got a few weeks here between now and the big event at the 1st of June, and I thought we got to have our absolute showstoppers in May. Better call Dave Benner.
Great calculation.
Now, Dave, you've written a lot about American history. You've written a lot about the Constitution, as the aforementioned book. But I know you have your sights set on a particular individual, and everybody who survived second grade social studies class, they probably know George Washington, probably know Benjamin Franklin. They may even, God forbid, they might know who Thomas Jefferson is. But I bet they don't know the guy you're writing about right now. Who is Thomas Paine?
Wow, so what a question. What wasn't Thomas Paine is probably a better question. He had such a long and elaborate life, but born an Englishman, commoner, lower artisan class, really nothing to speak of in regard to his pedigree. He changed the course of Western civilization in general, and there wouldn't be an independent America without him. So what wasn't he is a better question, and we can get into, more in-depth, granular areas of his life, but that's the most succinct way to put it. But he was so much more than that, too. He played a big impact in the political transformation of France, which a lot of Americans don't know about. But of course, he's most commonly known here as the author of Common Sense, the most prominent political pamphlet that, before any others, called for the severance of the American colonies from the British Crown.
Now, if you do a quick Wikipedia on Thomas Paine, right off the bat it says that he is a political theorist and a philosopher. But let's kind of start with the broad strokes. What era in history does Thomas Paine reside?
Well, he was born in 1737 in Thetford, England, so his life mostly spanned the latter part of the 18th century, although he didn't die until 1809. So he actually lived a very long life. And actually, that's one of the things I point out in my book is that in 7 particular individual incidents, he escaped an early death. 2 of them are very prominently known amongst people that would, do a cursory examination of his life. But he had a knack for surviving things that, should have put him in the grave.
Well, let's talk about that then really quick before we get into some of the other fundamentals. Survived death several times that should have put him in an early grave. Tell us maybe about a few of those, but tell us, how did such tragedy befall the man? Was he just no good, Dave?
Well, some crazy incidences. So in one episode, as a young man, he tried his hand at privateering. So a lot of people wouldn't know what this is or have much of a comparison point to today. But back in the day, before there were well-established nation-based navies, individual citizens embarked in plundering missions against enemies of their own country. For instance, England during the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War, they would know it as in Europe, and France engaged in many such scuffles on the high seas, whereupon privateers would, take prizes or plunder from enemy vessels. And Paine was involved in one of such operations, but on the English side, which is ironic because he essentially plundered from the nation he once helped nurture. But in that, he narrowly escaped an episode on a famous British privateer commanded by one named William Death that engaged a frigate of the French that basically destroyed it. And almost all the crew died. And Thomas Paine was only saved from going on that misadventure from his father, who pleaded with him not to go on it. But he was involved in other plunders. So that's one case. There's many others, including the time he almost died during the Reign of Terror, when the Jacobins had taken over the French revolutionary government and almost put him on the scaffold and severed his head from him. He was sentenced to death in England for seditious libel for printing The Rights of Man, his most famous political treatise. An enraged former tenant that rented his property in New York nearly shot him through his window one time after a run binge also. So many different cases, and there's more than that in the book.
Now, we'll look at a couple of those cases over in Europe. So you have to be a special kind of person to almost be executed in France and England, I would take it. So, what is it about his writings and activity that caused him to be an enemy of perhaps all the best people, depending on how you're looking at it?
Absolutely. So we'll start with England there. He printed The Rights of Man, which was unambiguous in its call to end monarchy. He thought the British monarchical system was a despotic system, a tyrannical system, and actually was a type of form of slavery because what Paine uh, kind of elucidated in that work was that if you're under a monarchical system as a subject, you're essentially beholden to the whims of one particular noble family, regardless of how pure their aims were, regardless of how moral their impositions were, regardless of any other factor. So, Paine thought that to be bound in all ways whatsoever, which is the exact text of what was called the Declaratory Act, one of the most contentious acts that the patriots in America viewed from the British, was treacherous, and he made no bones about it. In The Rights of Man, he also called for an end to, imperialistic wars and other things that he thought had just plagued Europe from time immemorial. So, in this, he roused the suspicions of British agents in William Pitt the Younger's government in England, and Pitt the Younger was notorious for enacting a unprecedented censorship campaign in England that brought many people to prosecution for printing, things that the government didn't approve of. It was a much different time back then, and it's hard to even put much relation to it now. But back then, Paine was tried for seditious libel for essentially saying that the English monarchy was evil, and he was sentenced in absentia to death for doing so. Um,
Now, I know you said that it's hard to imagine such things being taking place today, but I know that it wasn't just in Britain that he had his trouble, even though that's in terms of being a traitor. The definition would fit in so much as he was born in England and he was speaking out against the English crown. How did he get in trouble in France?
Oh, thanks for saying that. I knew I forgot to mention that. So in France, he at first was viewed as a universal celebrity. The Rights of Man was a bombastic hit, probably the best-selling classical liberal treatise ever sold. And it propelled him to stardom in France, so much so that the region of Calais elected him to be a representative in their provisional revolutionary government that was concocting a new constitution and a new republican system. So he, without being able to speak a lick of France, was elected to be a representative for the first time in his life, and he took that honor. However, I think two major things put him in the crosshairs of what became, the most malignant faction that rose in those days, the Jacobins. So number one, when the French revolutionaries wanted to put King Louis XVI to the guillotine, Paine actually spoke out in his defense. And you might say, how can this be? Paine was the most anti-monarchical person of his time, and he really was. But number one, he thought that Louis XVI wasn't emblematic of the problem. He thought the problem was systematic, that the entire Bourbon monarchy was despotic, and it wasn't Louis XVI. Actually, he thought Louis XVI was a relatively just king in comparison to many of his predecessors, because especially for the reason that he helped the American revolutionaries win the war against Britain. The other thing was that he became a rival of Marat. Marat was a famous writer of the Jacobins that was one of the most radicals, and he raised the ire within the ranks of the Jacobins, so much so that when they rose to power, when the revolutionary Paris Commune essentially took over the government, he was targeted first and removed as representative for not being a French citizen. And he languished in prison for almost a year in Luxembourg prison, now called Luxembourg Palace, because ostensibly for the reason that he wasn't a citizen. But it looks like from the records we have and Robespierre's notes that he was targeted for his opposition to the Jacobins.
Now that's interesting because for someone to be speaking out about the problems with systemic problems with forms of governance as opposed to individual bad actors, you can fast forward even to, hashtag current year. And if you're someone who is deeply opposed to one politician or another, you might have an audience. But being opposed to the system will get you called a crank by either side of the political aisle. So by that nature, considering that that's still the case today, Thomas Paine sounds like someone who fits the definition of being far, far ahead of his time.
He was an unapologetic crank. He would have taken it kindly to be told that. In fact, he did. After Common Sense was written, one adversary called him a crack-brain zealot for democracy, for instance. And that was about the worst insult you could give someone back then, to tell them they believed in democracy. But I mean, he really was portrayed that way. He was absolutely unapologetic about it. He believed that principle was much more important than, what was respectable, what was common, what was within what Tom Woods called the index card of allowable opinion. So he certainly, lived that throughout his life, and actually lost him many friends and made him many enemies too.
Well, we'll get to that as towards the end, I think. But to move on to the next step, you just mentioned common sense. Tell for people who are totally unaware of Thomas Paine, so they're probably unaware of his writings as well. What was common sense, and how did that sort of transform the era in his image?
Well, the undercurrent was calling for an unambiguous separation of the North American colonies from the British Crown. And this was written at the end of 1775. To put this in perspective, at that time, the Continental Congress was sending the olive branch petition to Britain to say, hey, let's come to some kind of peaceful reconciliation before, you perceive this as kind of some rebellious severance. But Paine said that's exactly what we need to do. And he said that for a few reasons. One, he said that the British system was corrupt and that it was established by a bastard Norman, William the Conqueror, who essentially established the kingdom through a usurpation. So it's not a legitimate government in his eyes. Paine believed in the Lockean conception of the social contract, which meant that all government should be set up to protect the life, liberty, and property of its inhabitants, and it had to be voluntary amongst those that set it up. He also said that even if British Parliament could give the North American colonies representation, it wouldn't be feasible, and logistics would prevent it from being able to be workable back then. He also said, well, the colonies had acted autonomously and developed their own culture that is not necessarily conducive to what British has for us. That this system's unstable. It cannot demand compliance of the North American colonies, and that they should sever themselves. But beyond that, Paine also said that they should establish what he called a continental charter. And this was kind of the first callings for a written constitution in germ. He called for that in Common Sense. So he said that immediately the colonies should sever themselves and establish this continental charter that makes it completely distinct from a British monarchical colony.
Now, some of the language you're using there in describing Paine and his work, it definitely evokes memories of the Constitution. It evokes memories of a Declaration of Independence, of a Bill of Rights. So it sounds like perhaps he was quite the influence on some of the other, perhaps more popular players of the age. So what were some of his relationships with some of the biggest American figures that we would all know?
Oh man! So when he first wrote Common Sense, he was an absolute nobody. He was a publisher of the Pennsylvania Magazine, which was one of the most prominent magazines of its time. But none of the illustrious figures we know of today knew of him at that time. It took until writing that his work got out there and probably sold about 100 to 150,000 copies by the end of 1776, the best-selling pamphlet that had ever been released at that point. And that brought him into the knowledge of people like George Washington, Charles Lee, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Benjamin Rush, who helped actually suggest the title Common Sense. He was going to call it Plain Truth. And because of that, he actually networked well and made relations with some of like the biggest and most powerful American Republican aristocrats of the time. So, for instance, his friendship with Benjamin Franklin spanned essentially till the end of Franklin's life, and his friendship with Jefferson in particular lasted to the end of his life. I mean, that was one of his longest lasting friendships. John Adams although he at sometimes pointed to the merits of common sense, was not a big fan of Paine. He thought he was too radical and went far too far. But nonetheless, even in old age, John Adams admitted that no one had made such an imprint on his age as common sense. And he said with reluctance, and I point this out in the book, call it then the age of Paine. And he despised the guy. So he made a huge impact on that class. He knew almost everyone of prominence of that time. In his later years, he was much more of an adversary toward the Federalists than he ever was in his earlier years. And he kind of vacillated between liking or disliking certain ones, but almost everyone knew about him, at least in the American system.
Now, I know that it's really become in vogue nowadays to view historical figures through a modern lens, which I think a lot of historians would agree is a bit unfair when you're going multiple centuries back and applying modern day principles and values to historic figures. Then everyone is going to be painted in a bad light. But Thomas Paine is particularly interesting. Besides that, because as you had alluded to earlier, he had some rocky times with some of those relationships a little bit later in life. So what happened there? And then I'm going to have a follow up question as well of does that contribute to, or why don't we know Thomas Paine as well as we know some of these other people?
Yeah, so I'll skip to the second part. It absolutely contributes to why we don't know of him as well, what he did and the friendships that he broke. And I'll give you kind of two overarching topics in general. So, number one is he denounced George Washington, his lifelong friend up until the mid 1790s, later in life. And the reason why is because when he was caught by the Jacobins and placed into Luxembourg Palace, he didn't think that the American administration, and in particular, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, his name was Gouverneur Morris at the time, very well known figure in his time as well, did not press for his American citizenship because, as Paine saw it, the official reasons that the government was giving for his captivity was the fact that he wasn't a French citizen. But if his American citizenship was pressed, well, they were under cordial relations at the time, more or less. I mean, not completely, but that should have established him to be set free. Now, Gouverneur Morris, like in his private works, you can tell he was utterly unsympathetic to Paine's plight. He did not like Paine. He thought the rights of man had gone too far, and even perhaps thought he deserved some some punishment for it. Now, the extent to which Washington knew about this or not is a little bit unclear, and Washington never actually responded to Paine's tirade against him, which was widely published, not only sent to Washington, but published in pamphlet form. But Paine took it personally that Washington did not work harder to set him free in his most trying days. And Paine thought that it was because Washington was playing politics, and it could have been. Washington at that time wanted to establish closer relations with Britain at the time, and may have thought that pressing for Paine's case would have jeopardized that relationship. At least Paine believed that. And he said all sorts of insulting things toward the president, including that, history would not remember him, that he would be remembered as more of a power hungry and ambitious person than a disinterested person that he's known for, etc. And that lost him not only the friendship of Washington, but almost all of his Federalist supporters. To say something like that about Washington at the time was, an insane prospect. He was the most widely respected person in the world. The other thing is, Paine wrote a series of two works called The Age of Reason. And The Age of Reason was a deistic treatise that, while backing religion in terms of a singular creator, disavowed and basically rejected all of the miraculous aspects of Christianity. Paine believed in a single creator, but not one that intervened in the world after having created the earth. And he thought that God's works could be seen in nature. So because of this, he doubted almost everything in the Bible, even though he acknowledged like the moral teachings of Jesus Christ and things like that. But he completely doubted, the truth that the Bible held the divine truth, right? So because of this, again, an incredibly unpopular thing to do, especially in the midst of a second great awakening where Protestantism in particular was at one of its zeniths in terms of, how widely adhered to that doctrine was.
So those are definitely some bold words coming in that particular age, and from someone who had been so influential leading up through the American Revolution. Was there anything in particular in his later life post-Revolution that was still particularly earth-shattering or inspiring, other than cutting ties with friends?
Yeah, I mean, he wrote so many different things, and one of the things that my book does is explores other parts of his life than political. A lot of people don't know this, but he was a brilliant architect. Paine stood at the cutting edge of an engineering revolution when he supported iron-based bridges, and he wrote amazing works that elaborated upon how well that iron bridges could function in kind of the future. And he never had a permanent bridge built, but he did build an iron bridge that basically stood as a prototype and was well reviewed by some of its viewers. Now, at that time, he had kind of been drawn back into the French Revolution and things like that, so he was never able to put his full focus on that. But he wrote, engineering contributions. Toward the end of his life, he also wrote a theory on why yellow fever was caused. It turned out to be incorrect, but I think that in some ways he was on the right track. He also wrote about the decline of the English financial system. He lambasted England's system of finance in the late 18th century because it had adhered to a fiat standard. And Paine was a hard money warrior that thought that paper money wasn't money, it was the ghost of money, like Jefferson thought. So he contributed in so many different ways to many things toward the end of his life. But he certainly didn't completely find his calling after he returned from France to the United States in 1802. After that point, he was largely made a pariah of most people that, called him an atheist, even though actually, ironically, he wrote the first Age of Reason as a response to Jacobin-oriented atheism. He believed in deism, but certainly not traditional Christianity. Um, so he made many different contributions. There's more on in the book that's covered where he wrote about what should be done with like the North American territories in the United States, and all sorts of other things.
Now, of all the different relationships that he enjoyed, and unfortunately so many that came to an end before the end of his life, one of the ones that I believe, you can correct me on this, one of the ones that I believe was strong to the very end was that of Thomas Jefferson. What was it about the connection between Jefferson and Paine that endured all of that controversy to the end?
Yeah, good question. And absolutely that's the case. I mean, he had other friendships, especially with like James Monroe and James Madison, but Thomas Jefferson was one of his closest friends. And, he and Jefferson agreed on so many things, not just political philosophy, the Lockean social contract theory. They both, had an issue morally with slavery. I mean, it's hard for some people to rationalize that given that Jefferson was a slave owner, but they both displayed in their civic duties attempts to curtail the institution in different ways. Paine was an outright abolitionist before almost anyone else was. As publisher of the Pennsylvania Magazine, he published an essay called Africans America. I'm sorry, African Slavery in America. And, Jefferson would have empathized with that. But the two grew even closer in some ways because they were both attacked by, American nationalists and Federalists, especially after and in the midst of the Revolution of 1800, where Jefferson was elected president after a very contentious battle with John Adams and, as it turned out, Aaron Burr, that Paine had a new hope for American republicanism after Jefferson had won. And it was one of the things that inspired him to come back. After his return, a lot of people shunned Paine, but actually Jefferson invited him into the White House. Back then it was called the Presidential Mansion. And the two were seen, walking with each other. Now, that only lasted a brief period, but even until the end of his life, Paine had maintained a cordial written relationship with Jefferson. And like I've kind of alluded to, they actually shared kind of similar, but not the same opinions on things like religion, which were extremely unpopular. So I think they had a special bond in the way where they agreed on many points that would have been, just incredibly controversial at the time.
Now, you brought up, of course, the dreaded S word, slavery, and pointed out already that Thomas Paine was a true abolitionist in the sense way before many others. Now, one would think that something like that would improve his historical image in current year, but I'm not sure that's the case. Why is there still such a disconnect?
Yeah, I think some circles do try to revive his reputation on that basis. Like, I know the Thomas Paine National Historical Association talks about this a lot, and the Huguenot Society that runs his cottage today, that you can still see in New Rochelle, does the same. But he's really been overshadowed because the latter two things we talked about, more or less his attack on George Washington, and I think the Age of Reason, even though that has influenced new atheism to an extent that no other work really from that time has. And people like Christopher Hitchens have overtly said that Paine was a precursor to many of his ideas. But you're right. I mean, it doesn't seem like Paine's contributions to abolitionism and anti-slavery efforts are very, well addressed or broadcast, even though, his words helped inspire one of the first gradual manumission laws of all time. Many of your viewers might not know this, but for instance, in 1780, Pennsylvania passed an act that said after X date, no one will be born a slave again. And Paine's theories on that helped inspire those on the committee that wrote that law. He was close to them, and their friendships were tangible in making that happen. So it's hard to know, Alan, but you're right. I think there is kind of a avenue where we can bring him to the limelight because of that. It is, an inescapably important contribution, whereupon a lot of people didn't think that could be resolved in the age, but Paine said that it should be unapologetically.
I'm gonna ask you to do just a tad bit of prognosticating. So really quick, what was the year that Thomas Paine passed away?
1809 in New York City.
1809. So well after the Revolution, after the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, but well before the era of American Civil War. What do you think, knowing just how much of a crank, if you will, that Thomas Paine was, knowing how willing he was to speak out against systems and people, even if they were popular and even if they were his friends, what do you think Paine would have thought about the lead up to the war between the states?
Oh, man, it's so hard to really to predict this, but Paine was not expressly concerned with federalism. I'll just say that. Paine believed that the United States should more or less, even though having distinct cultures, be part of the same kind of power apparatus. And I think he would have dreaded any kind of fissure of the American states. But that said, he also dreaded, the consolidation of power in few hands and imposing power from a centralized bureaucracy, much like England had done. So it's really hard for me to answer that. So at a cop out, I think he would have actually been more of a unionist, but he certainly would have dreaded, the power of the Lincoln administration in the run up to the war and how it was utilized to do things like institute a draft, suspend the writ of habeas corpus, jail distance, things like that. He certainly would have been against that because he lambasted Napoleon and William Pitt the Younger for doing the same. So.
Well, on that note, as we had mentioned earlier in the show, you've written books about the 14th Amendment. You've written Compact of the Republic, talking about the League of States and the Constitution. Of course, Thomas Paine was influential, if not in the room writing the documents, he was certainly very influential in everything that was going on. What would you say today, in looking at the modern political landscape? What is one of the biggest things that you feel like Thomas Paine's vision, influence, however you want to call it, can still be seen in modern America?
I'll give you two. The absolutism for free speech. There are free speech absolutists today, but that was not a popular prospect in most of the world in Paine's time, especially in Britain and France, where they cracked down on political works. But now we take it essentially as, as what is used to us to an extent of it's the air in the sky, it's the grass on the ground, but that we can criticize our public officials without retribution is unambiguously the result of Paine's winning that war. William Pitt the Younger won his censorship campaign for the moment, but he didn't win the war. The other thing is that government isn't tied to religion whatsoever in many corners of the world now. Back then, established churches were the way of the world, but Paine backed kind of the Virginian example that, disconnected the established church from the civil government. And some of the American states never even had an established uh, presence as far as religion in their governing system. And Paine lauded that in the Rights of Man. You can go back to the Rights of Man and look at how beneficial that is. That man can worship as he wishes. There's no test oaths that prevent him from serving as a public official because of that. So free speech and the severance of religion from state.
On that note, you're writing this magnum opus. I believe you're just about wrapping things up. Do you have a title for the book, and about what time do you think people are going to be able to enjoy it?
Yeah, it is finished. The final title is Thomas Paine, A Lifetime of Radicalism, and it will be available around Thanksgiving. So right now it's with the editor. I'm pleased to have the endorsement of Tom Woods, Jeff Dice, Brad Berzer, um, Kevin Gutzman, and some others that will be blurbing it. Very happy to have their support on this, but it's in an editing process that will take a few months. Also working with the artist to design the cover, but around Thanksgiving.
Around Thanksgiving. As it pertains to some of your other books, such as Compact of the Republic, what are the chances that people are going to be able to get signed copies of Dave Benner's work at the fourth annual It's Too Late live show on June 4th?
It is as sure as the severance of the American colonies from the British Empire in 1776, and that will happen. I will. Oh, I'm sorry. By June, it won't happen. So it's not a sure thing. It won't happen at all, but it will happen by Thanksgiving. I will have a system whereupon you can contact me and get signed copies, but it won't be by then. I do
No, no,
hope
no,
to.
no. I'm talking about Compact of the Republic.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Alan. Yeah, I can have that for sure. We will have signed copies. I haven't announced this officially yet on Facebook, but that book is also for the first time now available in hardcover. So I can definitely do that.
That is awesome. Dave, where can people go to support you and enjoy more of your content?
Yeah, www.davebenner.com. That's kind of a central hub where you can see the articles I write, the books I write, etc. I also contribute to the Mises Institute and the Abbeville Institute and the 10th Amendment Center at times. So check those sites, search for my name if you want, and check me out on Facebook. I'm also at dbenner83 on Twitter.
Dave, I'm so sad that we really don't have time to talk any sports ball because the NFL draft is literally happening as we speak. Yeah, I know. Unfortunately, Green Bay did not draft seven new wide receivers for Aaron Rodgers, so the world is literally collapsing in Wisconsin as we speak. But we just don't have any time. But Dave, I'm gonna get you out of here on this one.
Yeah, sounds good, man. We got two receivers though, but thanks for having me, man. I really
Wait,
appreciate
hold
it.
on. We're getting you out of here on this one.
Okay, I didn't know someone was coming. All right.
Is a Pop Tart a giant piece of ravioli?
Oh man, I should have known this was coming. I didn't prepare for this question. Knowing you, yeah, it's totally a ravioli. The fillings isn't consequential to what a ravioli is, so it's absolutely a ravioli.
That is correct. Dave has won the bonus round. Dave, it's always such a pleasure, man. We should hang out more often.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. We will, man, and I appreciate you having me on. Keep the show going, man.